"Sign here and this debt disappears," I told her, sliding the folder across my desk with a pen resting on top of it like the whole transaction was as simple as it sounded. Grace Lindqvist looked at me the way people look at a stranger offering them something too good to be true, which is to say, correctly, because it was. She signed on the line I pointed to, thanked me with the stiff, careful gratitude of someone who has learned not to trust kindness, and left my office believing she had just saved her mother's bakery from collapse. She had no idea that 4 pages back, in paragraph language dense enough to make most lawyers' eyes glaze over, she had also just agreed to become my wife. I want to tell you I felt good about that. I didn't. I felt like a man who had finally found a way to pay for something he could never fully repay, and had chosen the only currency he had left, which was control over exactly how the debt got settled. To understand why I buried a marriage clause inside a debt relief contract instead of simply telling Grace Lindqvist the truth, you need to understand what my father did to her family 11 years before that signature, and what I found in his office 3 weeks after his funeral. My name is Adrian Cole. I run a private investment firm my father built by being extremely good at finding companies that were vulnerable and extremely comfortable with what it took to acquire them. Cole Capital has a reputation in this city for precision, and for a long time I told myself precision and integrity were the same thing, because it was easier than examining whether they were. Grace's father, Peter Lindqvist, ran a small specialty bakery supply manufacturer, the kind of business that made the ovens and mixing equipment half the bakeries in this state depended on. 11 years ago, my father's firm identified it as an acquisition target, not because it was failing, but because it was profitable and undervalued, and Peter Lindqvist was too proud and too principled to sell to a firm he suspected would gut it for parts. My father's team manufactured a liquidity crisis. I didn't know this until I found the ledgers. They quietly bought up Lindqvist Manufacturing's supplier contracts through shell companies, squeezed the terms until the business couldn't make payroll, then offered Peter Lindqvist a rescue loan at terms designed to be impossible to fully repay, all while presenting themselves publicly as a good-faith investor, saving a struggling local business. Peter never sold the company outright. He just spent the next decade drowning in a debt structure engineered specifically to keep him drowning, making minimum payments that barely touched the principal, watching his daughter grow up in a house that never stopped being one bad month away from losing everything. I found all of this in a locked drawer 3 weeks after my father's funeral. In a private ledger he apparently kept for deals he was proud enough of to remember but ashamed enough to never mention out loud. I sat in his office until 2 a.m, reading through 11 years of quiet, deliberate cruelty dressed up as smart business, and somewhere around the 4th folder, I found Grace Lindqvist's name on the current outstanding balance, $640,000 her family still owed a company I now controlled. For a crisis my father had manufactured from nothing, I could have simply forgiven the debt. Anonymously, quietly, a clerical write-off buried in year-end filings that nobody outside the accounting department would ever question. I told myself for 2 weeks that this was what I was going to do. Then I met her, purely by accident, at a charity auction I attended because my mother insisted, and I watched Grace Lindqvist bid on a donated stand mixer for her mother's bakery with a kind of fierce, exhausted hope that told me everything about how much this business meant to a family my own family had spent a decade quietly destroying. I approached her that night under a manufactured pretext, said I was interested in specialty bakery equipment financing, which was technically true in the way that a house fire is technically a source of heat. We talked for 20 minutes. She was sharp, funny in a dry, unshowy way, fiercely protective of her mother in every sentence she spoke, and completely unaware that the man buying her a drink controlled the debt that had been slowly strangling her family for 11 years. She told me, unprompted, about growing up helping her father balance the books at the kitchen table some nights, watching him recalculate the same numbers over and over like a different arrangement of the same bad math might eventually produce a better answer. She laughed about it the way people laugh about things that still hurt, quick and a little too bright, and said she'd given up asking him why the debt never seemed to shrink no matter how many good years the bakery had. I remember standing there holding a glass of wine I wasn't drinking, listening to her describe, without knowing it, the exact mechanism my father had built to keep her father's math permanently unsolvable, and feeling something in my chest go cold in a way that had nothing to do with the open bar. I told myself that night that simply forgiving the debt wasn't enough. My father hadn't just cost the Lindqvists money. He'd cost Grace a version of her 20s that should have been about anything other than triage. I wanted to do more than erase a number in a ledger. I wanted to actually fix what had been broken, and some cowardly, calculating part of me convinced myself the cleanest way to guarantee that was to attach myself to the outcome permanently, instead of writing a check and walking away without ever having to face what my name had cost her family. There was also, if I'm honest, a second reason, smaller and more selfish, sitting underneath the noble one. My grandmother's foundation, the charitable trust that controlled a third of Coal Capital's voting shares, required the firm's controlling officer to be married in order to maintain trustee status, a condition my grandmother had written into her estate specifically to keep my father from running the company entirely unchecked after her death. I turned 33 that year. The clock on that provision was closing. I told myself the marriage clause solved two problems with one signature, and I let that efficiency excuse the deception, the same kind of efficient, borrowed morality my father had used to justify 11 years of manufactured debt. I structured the contract carefully. Full forgiveness of the $640,000 balance, immediate and irrevocable, regardless of what she decided afterward. A marriage clause requiring only a civil registration. No cohabitation demanded. Full annulment available within 90 days at her sole discretion with no financial claim against her whatsoever. I told myself the annulment window made it fair, made it a choice instead of a trap. I understand now that hiding a choice inside 4 pages of dense legal language isn't actually offering someone a choice at all. It's just delaying the moment they find out you took one away from them. Grace found the clause 6 days after signing, when her lawyer, a family friend doing the paperwork as a favor, called her in a panic having finally read the full document line by line. She showed up at my office without an appointment, slammed a printed copy of page 4 onto my desk, and asked, in a voice gone dangerously quiet, whether I thought this was funny. My assistant tried to stop her at the door. I heard the commotion through the wall and told him to let her through, because some part of me had been waiting for this exact confrontation since the moment I'd watched her sign, the way you wait for weather you know is coming even while you hope it changes direction. She didn't sit down. She stood in front of my desk in the same coat she'd worn to the charity auction, and for a moment neither of us said anything at all. The printed page between us like a live wire neither of us wanted to be the first to touch. I told her it wasn't a joke. I told her the debt was already forgiven regardless of what she decided next, that the annulment option was real and she could use it the same afternoon if she wanted, and that I owed her an explanation I should have given her before she ever signed anything. Then I told her about my father, about the ledgers, about 11 years of a manufactured crisis dressed up as generosity. I watched her face go through disbelief, then fury, then something quieter and more devastating. The particular grief of learning that a decade of her family's suffering had a name and an address the whole time, and that name had been sitting across a desk from her offering fake bakery equipment financing at a charity auction 2 months earlier. "You could have just told me the truth," she said. "You could have handed me proof of what your father did and let me decide what justice looked like. Instead, you turned my family's suffering into a contract with your name attached to it." I didn't have a good answer for that because she was right. I told her the only honest thing I had left, which was that I was afraid the truth alone wouldn't be enough to actually fix anything. That money without accountability was just another version of what my father had already done to her, buying his way out of consequences. I told her I didn't trust myself to walk away and simply feel better for having done the noble thing while her family's decade of damage remained someone else's permanent problem to manage, alone. She didn't annul the marriage that day. She told me later it was mostly spite, that she wanted to make me sit in the discomfort of the arrangement I'd built instead of letting me off easy with a quick legal exit. For the first month, we were essentially strangers who shared a legal document and nothing else. She kept her apartment. I kept mine. We saw each other exactly twice, both times at her lawyer's office, discussing terms with the frozen politeness of two people negotiating a hostage situation. The month before that, our only real conversation happened by accident, at her lawyer's office, when a scheduling mix-up left us waiting together for 45 minutes with nothing to do but sit across a small conference table in uncomfortable silence. She finally asked, not looking up from her phone, whether I actually felt anything when I found those ledgers, or whether guilt for men like me was just another line item to manage efficiently. I told her the truth, that I'd sat in my father's office until the sun came up, that I'd thrown up in the bathroom down the hall once I understood the full scope of what he'd done, and that I still didn't fully trust my own motives even now. Because a man capable of hiding a marriage clause inside a debt relief contract clearly hadn't finished learning the lesson his father's ledgers were trying to teach him. She looked at me for a long moment after that, the first time she'd really looked at me since the day she found the clause, and said only that she appreciated the honesty, even if it didn't change anything yet. It didn't. But it was the first brick in something neither of us had agreed to start building. The thing that actually changed anything wasn't a grand gesture. It was her mother's stroke 11 weeks into the marriage. A Tuesday morning that started as an ordinary shift at the bakery and ended with Grace's mother collapsed behind the register. Rushed to a hospital that required insurance paperwork, Grace didn't have the emotional bandwidth to sort through alone that week. I heard about it from her lawyer, who mentioned it in passing during an unrelated call. I showed up at the hospital that evening without asking permission, sat in the waiting room 3 chairs down from Grace, and didn't say anything for over an hour. Because I understood, finally, that showing up quietly might be the only kind of honesty I had left to offer her. "You didn't have to come," she said eventually, not looking at me. "I know," I said. "I wanted to, because you feel guilty, because you're my wife." And I said, "Even if that's a technicality neither of us chose honestly, and because whatever my father cost your family, I'm not going to let you sit in a hospital alone doing insurance paperwork on top of everything else tonight." I handled the paperwork. I called in a favor with a hospital administrator I knew, made sure her mother got moved to a better room, quietly covered costs Grace's insurance wouldn't touch without ever mentioning it, because I'd learned, finally, that the mentioning was the part that turned generosity back into leverage. Her mother recovered slowly over the following months. During that time, Grace and I fell into something neither of us had planned or fully named, dinners that started as logistics and turned into real conversation, a growing reluctant trust that neither of us trusted at first, because it had started inside a lie neither of us could fully forgive. We developed small rituals without ever discussing them out loud. I started showing up at the bakery on Sunday mornings before opening, ostensibly to review the restructured supplier contracts, though we both knew the paperwork rarely took more than 20 minutes and I usually stayed for 2 hours. Grace would hand me a rolling pin without asking if I wanted one, and I'd stand there badly shaping dough while she corrected my technique with the same patient exasperation she used on her mother's part-time staff. Neither of us called it anything. It just became the shape our Sundays took, and I found myself organizing entire weeks around the promise of that flour-dusted, unglamorous hour, more than I'd organized my life around anything in longer than I wanted to admit. 6 months into the marriage, Grace found the second ledger, the one I hadn't shown her, the one detailing exactly how much profit Cole Capital had extracted from her family's decade of manufactured struggle. She confronted me with it late one night, furious in a way she hadn't been since the day she found the marriage clause, asking why I'd hidden this too. What else I was still protecting her from out of some misguided instinct to control how much pain she was allowed to feel at once. I told her the truth. Finally, completely, no more careful omissions. I told her the number. I told her I intended to return every dollar Cole Capital had ever extracted from her family, not as an anonymous write-off, but as a public, formal restitution with her family's name attached publicly to the wrong that had been done to them. Because I'd realized somewhere in those 6 months that the thing I'd taken from her father wasn't just money. It was the truth being known, and I wasn't going to let my own comfort keep that hidden any longer. Even if going public damaged Cole Capital's reputation permanently, it did. The story broke that winter, my own board forcing a restructuring, my grandmother's foundation nearly stripping my trustee status entirely over the fallout. I didn't fight the consequences. I'd spent a year learning that fighting consequences was exactly the instinct that had built this whole mess in the first place. Grace stood beside me through the board hearings, though nobody would have blamed her for walking away entirely. When a reporter asked her, outside the courthouse, why she'd stayed married to the man whose father destroyed her family, she said something I still think about. "Because he's the first Cole who ever let the truth cost him something," she said. "That's not nothing. That's actually everything. We didn't have some grand cinematic reconciliation. We had a lot of hard, quiet dinners where we said true things to each other slowly, at a pace that felt earned instead of performed. I told her I loved her for the first time on an ordinary Tuesday, doing dishes in her mother's newly renovated bakery kitchen, and she didn't say it back right away, which felt more honest than if she had. She said it 3 weeks later, unprompted, standing in the same kitchen, flour on her hands, telling me she'd spent months waiting to feel it before she'd let herself say it, because she needed the words to be true and not just convenient. If you've ever inherited a debt you didn't create and spent your whole life quietly paying it down anyway, you understand exactly what it meant to Grace to hear the truth named out loud, finally publicly at real cost to the person who owed it. And if you've ever done something wrong in the name of fixing something worse, you understand exactly why I needed her to choose me freely, in the end, instead of simply being legally bound to a man who once thought a signature could stand in for an apology. We renewed our vows properly 2 years later, in front of both families, in the newly expanded bakery that bears both the Lindqvist name and a small plaque acknowledging exactly what happened to earn its restoration. Grace's mother cut the ribbon herself. I stood in the back of the crowd that day, the way I'd learned to stand in rooms that weren't really about me, and watched the woman I'd once tried to help through deception finally get to celebrate something true, built honestly this time from the ground up. Coal Capital looks different now too. Smaller, slower, considerably less profitable by the standards my father used to measure success, and considerably more mine in every way that actually matters. I kept the name on the door because erasing it felt like another version of hiding, but I changed almost everything underneath it, including an internal review process that flags exactly the kind of manufactured crisis my father once specialized in, so no other family finds themselves doing kitchen table math against a debt that was never designed to be solved. Grace still teases me, every so often, about the folder and the pen and the 6 words that started all of it, usually right before handing me a rolling pin on a Sunday morning and telling me, not unkindly, that I still can't shape a proper loaf to save my life. I've gotten better. Not perfect, but better. The same slow, unglamorous way everything real between us got better, one honest Sunday at a time, instead of one signature pretending to be an apology.